Is this, oh, it is on, good. Good evening, and welcome. I'm Nicole Boucher, the W.S. Lewis Librarian and Executive Director of the Lewis Walpole Library, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening to The Many Lives of Horace Walpole, a lecture by George Haggerty, Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Department of English at the University of California, Riverside. Before I go further, I do want to remind everyone that there is a reception following this lecture, so please join us then. This evening's lecture is just one of a wallapalooza of events that the library has organized for the current academic year in collaboration with members of the Yale faculty, current and former Lewis Walpole Library Fellows, and other friends and affiliates of the library in celebration of the tercentenary of the birth of Horace Walpole, 4th Earl of Orford, who was born in London on September 4th, 1717. I doubt that Walpole requires much explanation to this evening's audience. Inveterate chronicler of his own times and gifted correspondent, Walpole was also an art historian, antiquarian, art collector, Whig politician, and much, much more. The author of The Castle of Otranto, commonly considered the first Gothic novel, and the imaginative force behind the creation of his Gothic fantasy villa, Strawberry Hill, Walpole initially intrigued the young Yale graduate and student of the 18th century, Wilmar Sheldon Lewis, class of Yale 1918, and ultimately became a lifelong obsession, resulting in the largest collection anywhere of materials by or pertaining to Walpole and his circle, and the monumental Yale edition of Horace Walpole's correspondence, along with a number of other works authored by Wilmarth Lewis and his colleagues about Walpole's life, collections, and legacy. Mr. and Mrs. Lewis generously donated their collections, their property at Farmington, and endowed funds to support the library and enable us to continue their work into perpetuity, as we do every day up in Farmington, and we are very grateful to them for their generosity, because that is also what enables us to bring programs like this to campus. Among other library programs planned for this Walpole tercentenary year, we have our current exhibition, Global Encounters in the Archives, Britain's Empire in the Age of Horace Walpole, which is organized in collaboration with Professor Stephen Pincus and graduate students, and a related conference at the Graduate Club in February. A symposium on November 10th in Farmington, organized in collaboration with Professor Jonathan Kramnick, Maynard Mack Professor of English and Director of the Lewis Walpole Library, will focus on Walpole's Castle of Otranto and his broader literary legacy. And in May, an on-book reading of Walpole's controversial play, The Mysterious Mother, and a related symposium will be hosted here at the YCBA. In addition, this evening's lecture will be followed tomorrow afternoon by a public roundtable discussion on writing queer biography from the archives, led by George Haggerty and co-hosted by the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at 2:30. There is therefore no better way to launch this series of programs than with an exploration of the man himself, which brings us to this evening's speaker. George E. Haggerty received his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley in 1979 and has been on the faculty of the University of California, Riverside since 1981. He is the author of numerous articles and contributions to anthologies of 18th century literary studies, especially the Gothic and issues of sexuality, gender, and queer studies. His books include Gothic Fiction and Gothic Form, Unnatural Affections, Women in Fiction in the Latter 18th Century, Men in Love, Masculinity and Sexuality in the 18th Century, Queer Gothic, and Horace Walpole's Letters, Masculinity and Friendship in the 18th Century. George was also the general editor of Taylor and Francis's Encyclopedia of Gay Histories and Cultures, and he co-edited Professions of Desire, Lesbian and Gay Studies in Literature for the Modern Languages Association, and the Blackwell Companion to LGBTQ Studies. His forthcoming book, Queer Friendship, Male Intimacy in the English Literary Tradition, will be published this March by Cambridge University Press. A former fellow and frequent visitor to the Lewis Walpole Library, it's a great pleasure to us to bring George back to Yale. Most key to our presence here this evening is the fact that he is also currently working on a biography of Horace Walpole. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming George Haggerty to the podium to present to us the many lives of Horace Walpole.
I want to thank Nicole for that lovely introduction. And I also appreciate everything that the Lewis Walpole Library has been able to offer in the many years that I've been using it. Nicole has been so welcoming at the library and an inspiration, and I encourage anyone who hasn't been there to go there soon. I'd also like to thank the Yale Center for British Art, especially the director Amy Myers and Jane Noah Sutko, senior manager of programs, who have made this event possible. And I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Cindy Roman, who works at the Walpole Library, mostly in the print collection. I think it was talking over lunch with Cindy that we planned this whole event, and I'm so delighted that it's come together like this. We missed Horace's 300th birthday by about a month, but I hope you'll pardon me if I ask you to sing happy birthday to Horace. I'd like to do it. I'd like to start that way. He deserves it. And not many people get to be celebrated after 300 years. I have a terrible voice. I'll step a little back from the microphone, but I hope everyone else will sing, and I will start. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Horace. Happy 300th birthday to you. Thank you so much. I've also provided a handout. I know it seems a bit too much like a class when there's a handout, but I read a lot from the letters, and I think it helps if you have a script of what I'm reading. In the opening pages of his still very useful biography of Horace Walpole, R.W. Ketton Cremer makes the point that one of the difficulties which confronts a biographer of Walpole is his remarkable versatility. He was active in many fields, in politics, social life, literature, architecture, antiquarianism, printing, and it's not easy to include them all in the compass of a single volume. Still, his volume was quite a smart little volume. This comment is certainly daunting to any biographer. But even though the works like The Castle of Otranto, 1764, and The Mysterious Mother, 1768, set new standards for what can be expressed in literary form, and the letters defy any attempt to describe or contain them, still we can start to come close to doing justice to all these accomplishments if we allow Horace Walpole himself to inspire us with his intelligence and his imagination. If he can be our inspiration, then we may find that we can begin to understand him. He always says a little more and even does a little more than we expect him to, and that's what makes him engaging. Walpole seems to have compartmentalized his life for posterity in the ways in which he composes his letters, writing to different correspondents on different topics. The first and last place we can find him is in his epistolary writing. In this vast correspondence, he was able to capture the spirit of his age like no one else. This is a famous portrait by James McArdle in 1757, Walpole at about 40 years of age. I think it's a great picture. To say that Horace Walpole was a writer first and foremost is demonstrably true if we consider the letters of an equal stature with The Castle of Otranto or The Mysterious Mother. But how could we not? The letters display a writer of style and substance who has only few equals in this age of epistolarity. At times, the writing is forceful and energetic. At times, it is elegant and almost effete, but it is always exactly what the situation calls for. There are almost as many Horace Walpoles as there are people he is writing to, and in that sense, his many lives come together in the correspondence more vividly than they do anywhere else. First, then, there is the Gothic Horace. Traipsing around England with his friend John Shute, Horace celebrates English architecture always with an eye toward how it might aid him in constructing his own Gothic abode. As he writes to Richard Bentley in August 1752, Horace and John have been traveling through Kent and Sussex, and this is the first quotation on the handout. Here we are, my dear sir, in the middle of our pilgrimage. Unless we should never return from this holy land of abbeys and Gothic castles, I begin a letter to you in hopes that some charitable monk, when he has buried our bones, will deliver it to you. We have had piteous distresses, but then we have had glorious sights. You shall hear of each in their order. Horace describes their trip as a pilgrimage in part because he views the discovery of Gothic materials for Strawberry Hill as a kind of quest. Strawberry Hill was the small country house in Twickenham that Horace transformed into a Gothic retreat. And he and John Shute are the knights errant, challenging the ogres of bad taste and paltry design in order to achieve the true end of beauty at Strawberry Hill. There are disappointments in this quest, as is clear in his account of Bishop Rochester's abode. 'Tis a paltry parsonage, with nothing of antiquity but 2 panes of glass purloined from Islick's chapel in Westminster Abbey, with that abbot's rebus and an eye of a slip of a tree. In the garden there is a clear little pond teeming with goldfish. And if you know anything about Horace, you know this is utter condemnation. At other times, they are quite overwhelmed at Gothic effects. We lay that night at Tunbridge Town and were surprised with the ruins of the old castle. The gateway is perfect and the enclosure formed into a vineyard by Mr. Hooker, to whom it belongs, and the walls spread with fruit, and the mount on which the keep stood planted in the same way. The prospect is charming, and a breach in the open walls below to a pretty Gothic bridge of 3 arches over the Medway. We honored this man for his taste, not but that we wished the committee at Strawberry were to sit upon it and stick cypresses among the hollows. Horace and John are attuned to Gothic effects, and they are quick to make judgments of taste that they can use in the designs for Strawberry. The committee at Strawberry, alluded to here as the group Horace, John Shute, and Richard Bentley. This committee, sometimes called the Committee of Taste, and whether or not Horace actually used that expression, he did use the committee to help maintain his high strictures of taste and to create a house that matched his personal Gothic vision. When I showed this picture in Riverside, the students said, "Oh, it must be a huge mansion," and it's actually not huge. It's a petite mansion, and Horace called it his little jewel box. And he once said to Horace Mann, "I want to just put it in an envelope and send it to you." Anyway, this is the recent resurfacing of the outside, which is, according to the historians of architecture, the way it looked in the 18th century. If Strawberry Hill absorbs Horace's consciousness with ideas of fan vaulting and exotic stairways, it also informs his dreams, and in so doing, it inspires a literary revolution. We are all familiar with the dream in which Horace records the inspirations for the Castle of Otranto, but it is worth repeating it here. After he published the novel, he wrote to his antiquarian friend, the Reverend William Cole, in order to explain how his imagination gave rise to such an eccentric work. I waked one morning in the beginning of last June from a dream, of which all I could recover was that I had thought myself in an ancient castle, a very natural dream for a head like mine, filled with Gothic story, and that on the uppermost banister of a great staircase, I saw a gigantic hand in armor. In the evening, I sat down and began to write without knowing in the least what I intended to say or relate. The work grew on my hands, and I grew fond of it. In short, I was so engrossed with my tale, which I completed in less than 2 months, that one evening I wrote from the time I had drunk my tea, about 6 o'clock, till half an hour after 1 in the morning, when my hands and fingers were so weary that I could not hold the pen to finish the sentence, but left Matilda and Isabella talking in the middle of a paragraph. That the origins of Gothic fiction can be discovered in Horace Walpole's dreams is intriguing enough. But here Horace is talking to another antiquary, and he finds his dreams an adequate explanation for the strange story he has penned. Cole responded in bemused respect, hardly imagining that he had read a work that would transform literary history. Walpole does seem to understand its significance, however, and in offering his dream, he offers a revolutionary rationale for the uncanny. His dream, we might say, becomes the unconscious of the age. Almost in anticipation of literary and psychoanalytic theories to come, Horace allows us to imagine private desires behind the stuff of castles and beleaguered damsels. We take that for granted, to be sure, but however sophisticated we are with psychoanalytic theory, Horace has been there before us. Gothic fiction, it seems, has always dealt in dreams. Many other Gothic writers would certainly agree, and I think if you just think about Gothic prefaces, think of the preface to Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. She takes us right into her dreams. Well, she learned how to do that from Horace Walpole. Here is a picture of the Gothic staircase from his dream. I'm not sure it looks threatening, but if you're standing right at the bottom, looking up, maybe that's the overwhelming Gothic impression. Obviously, it is a little staircase in the house, but it's decorated with Gothic tracery and so on. But Gothic history is not the only history that interested Horace. He was interested in the history of his age. As the son of one of England's greatest and most controversial prime ministers, Sir Robert Walpole, who lived from 1676 to 1745, Horace was attentive to contemporary politics. He often recorded current events in letters to Sir Thomas Mann, his distant relative and lifelong correspondent stationed in Florence. Maybe Horace the historian is most evident in his account of the trial of the Scottish lords for their involvement in the invasion of Bonnie Prince Charlie in 1745. When Horace sends Mann news of the victory over the rebels, he says, "The defeat is rendered total and the dispersion general. 'Tis our brave young Duke, the Duke of Cumberland. The town is all blazing round me as I write with fireworks and illuminations." That summer, several Scottish lords were tried for treason as a result of their participation in the Jacobite cause. The way in which Walpole describes this historical event gives it a kind of life it would not otherwise have. His descriptions brings events alive by nuanced detail and personal reflection. Here is Walpole's letter reporting the treason trials, and this letter is much, much longer. I've cut it down to just give a few highlights. The sight at once feasted one's eyes and engaged all one's passions. It began last Monday. 3 parts of Westminster Hall were enclosed with galleries and hung with scarlet. And the whole ceremony was conducted with the most awful solemnity and decency. 139 lords were present and made a noble sight on their benches. But the first appearance of the prisoners shocked me. Their behavior melted me. Lord Kilmarnock and Count Cromarty and Lord Cromarty were both past 40 but look younger. Lord Kilmarnock is tall and slender with an extreme fine person. His behavior a most just mixture between dignity and submission. If anything is to be reprehended, a little affected, and his hair too exactly dressed for a man in his situation. But when I say this, it is not to find fault with him, but to show how little fault there was to be found. This passage might be called classic Horace Walpole. His description of the event is careful and precise, but as soon as a feature seems out of place, he gives his assessment. Horace's instinct is to pierce the self-importance of the occasion with his own brand of satire, and in a longer version of a letter, he takes issue with the master of ceremonies, who thinks is a little too pompous for the occasion. But when the prisoners appear, he does not even disguise the depth of his emotion. He dramatizes his own engagement with the stature and demeanor of the prisoners, and he does this by revealing his own fascination with the person of each of them. The detail that I find most persuasive, however, in this description is in his description of Lord Kilmarnock, the misplaced affectation of having his hair too exactly dressed for a man in his situation. How indeed is the hair of someone on trial for treason to be dressed? That Horace suggests he knows the answer to this question is the very detail that makes the passage come alive. This is a scene of the execution of the Scottish lords after the trial, shortly after they were executed. And this is a print of that execution. After the Gothic Horace and the historian Horace, we need to remember Horace the collector. Horace Walpole was an inveterate collector. He collected books, artifacts, architectural bits, chinoiserie, porcelain, enamels, and other things that suggest a sharply honed, if not to say precious, taste. Walpole and many of his friends shared a perspective on personal experience that made them perfect confederates, fussing over the details of a find, rolling their eyes in mock frustration at the demands of a dealer, or waxing poetic about a prized possession. Here is Walpole enthusing to his friend Horace Mann, the British envoy at Florence, over a group of paintings Mann had just sent from there. I should just say, Mann was a distant cousin of Horace's. He'd been put in that position by Horace's father, and therefore was very grateful to the family. And when Horace and Gray were traveling in 1739, 1740, the Grand Tour, Mann welcomed them in Florence, and Horace bonded with Mann immediately. And from that time, they wrote letters for the rest of Mann's life, which was until 1786, without ever seeing each other again, but they kept up the correspondence. Anyway, here is one of those early letters from early in their correspondence. Last week I did not write at all because I was every day waiting for the Dominican, etc., which at last I got last night. But oh, that etc. And by that he's alluding to what else was in the package, which was G.M. Bologna's Bronze, a painting by Andrea del Sarto and Sosa Ferrato, Gino Reni's Magdalene, Donna Nato Creti's copy of Gino Reni's Paglione, a copy of Hermaphrodite, Vallet's copy of the statue of Livia, a Scatiola table, drawing of the Uffizi essences and views of Rome, etc. So it was a big package, right? It makes me write to you, but I must leave thee, etc., for I can't undertake to develop it. The charming Madame Sévigné had infinite wit, condescended to pun on sending her daughter an excessively fine pearl necklace. Voilà ma fille, un présent passant et tous les passés présents. Do you know what these words reduced to serious meaning are not sufficient for what you have sent me? Horace's pleasure in thing, the etc. of this things, the etc. of this letter, is at the heart of his impulse to collect. His father, of course, had been a collector before him, and although there was a lot that he didn't like about his father's house at Houghton, he did love the art that was on display there. Horace diverts that impulse away from grand masters and show-stopping portraits, and instead he concentrates on the miniature, the exotic, the Gothic, and the risqué. Strawberry Hill itself became part of this display, and Horace never tired of exhibiting his various collections. Also worth noting, this reference to Madame de Sévigné, the famous French woman of letters and letter writer, is by no means casual. She served to some extent as Horace's model as a letter writer. In Horace Walpole, two French women, Warren Harding Smith, discusses this influence. As Smith says, Madame de Sévigné's letters remained on Horace's shelves and deep in his affections. Horace is quoted as saying, "There's scarce a book in the world I love so much as her letters." This enthusiasm over gifts from Mann is repeated again and again in the correspondence. Often not gifts so much as commissions, Horace used Mann to help him amass an impressive collection. I have elsewhere noted Horace's enthusiasm over a bust of Caligula. I gaze on it from morning to night, and if it was possible for me to part with it, I would send it to you back as the only return, my dear sir, that I ever make you worthy of such a present. Or over what Mann calls a most beautiful antique eagle that has lately been found in Rome in the highest preservation, and as a far superior to that of Benvenuto Cellini, which Ganymede keeps, that is the worst that could be made at Hyde Park Corner. Walpole talks about other objects in his collections in similarly excited terms: Renaissance paintings and Italian sculpture, his collections of virtue's heads and enamels, and various miniatures, Lady Diana Beauclerk's drawings, and Anne Damer's statues all receive similar treatment. Italian artwork earned a special place at Strawberry Hill. Walpole saves his most poetic enthusiasm for the materials man set to him, but he's always collecting in his travels around England and always ready to add to his collections or in later life to replenish the splendid collections of his father that were dissipated by his nephew, Lord Orford. This is the gallery at Strawberry Hill, and you can see the eagle is featured, some portraits, other artifacts that Horace collected. Also notice the wonderful fan vaulting of the room and the wonderful architecture features, just remembering as you look at them that they're all made of paper mache. It's a simple living room in a country estate, and he's just Gothicized it with his imagination. This is another image from Strawberry Hill. This is in the library, the Gothic library. This room is a wonderful little library room. All the bookcases are shaped with Gothic arches. And this room also, just behind where he's sitting in that chair, is the famous glass closet where Horace kept all his most precious and pornographic materials. There aren't many pornographic, but a few. The final Horace that we will talk about this evening is Horace the Friend. His friendships are as varied as everything else in his life, but one thing is clear: when Horace valued a friend, he treated that friend with a kind of attention that is almost breathtaking. And there are such friends. Thomas Gray, the Eton College friend with whom Horace traveled on the continent and whose poems he championed and published at his Strawberry Hill Press. Horace Mann, with whom Horace kept up regular correspondence since their meeting in Florence in 1740 until Mann's death. William Mason, a literary friend and editor. Henry Fox, Richard Edgecombe, Lord Lincoln, Sir Charles Hanby Williams, friends from Eton and from London. George Montague, the country squire Horace was endlessly urging to London. And all the letters to these friends are kind, loving, informative, and challenging. The letters to Montague, for instance, he's always chiding him for staying in the country and begging him to come to London. And then when Montague says he's on his way to Strawberry Hill, Horace somehow isn't there, so it doesn't. I'm not sure what's going on there, but they're wonderful. The letters to these friends are wonderful. He does not often write about the power of friendship itself. But after the death of John Shute, he did just that in a letter to Horace Mann. Horace and John had been friends since they met in Florence in the early 1740s. Shute and his partner, Francis Whitehead, the Shuteheads, Horace called them for short. They were an 18th century gay couple, I think we can call them that with kind of safety, helped with Strawberry Hill and supported Horace in other ways as well. John and Horace shared their lives in ways few men do. This is what Horace wrote when John Shute died. This fatal year puts to the proof the nerves of friendship. I have lost Mr. Shute. It is a heavy blow, but such strokes reconcile oneself to parting with this pretty vision, life. What is it when one has no longer those to whom one speaks as confidentially as to one's own soul? Mr. Shute and I agreed invariably in our principles. He was my counsel in my affairs, was my oracle in taste, the standard to whom I submitted my trifles, the genius that presided over poor Strawberry. His sense decided me in everything, his wit and quickness illuminated everything. I saw him oftener than any man, went to him in every difficulty I had recourse, and him I loved to have here as our friendship was so entire, and we knew one another so entirely that he alone was at the least constraint to me. We passed many hours together without saying a syllable to each other, for we were both above ceremony. I left him without excusing myself, read or write before him as if he were not present. Alas, alas, and how self presides even in our grief. I am lamenting myself, not him. No, I am lamenting my other self, Half is gone, the other remains solitary. Age and sense will make me bear my affection with submission and composure, but forever that little forever remains. I shall miss him. My first thought will always be, I will go talk to Mr. Shute on this. The second, alas, I cannot, and therefore judge how my life is poisoned. I shall only seem to be staying behind one that is set out a little before me. John Shute died in 1776, so Horace lived for 20 more years, but still, he's imagining himself catching up. This very touching account of the loss that Walpole feels in his 50s on the death of his closest personal friend is truly moving. Shute was energetic, intelligent, and witty enough to be a match for the indomitable Horace. I'm lamenting my other self, he says. This is intimate praise and deeply felt loss, the loss that echoes through Strawberry Hill that Horace helped to design and decorate. I am lamenting myself, not him. No, I am lamenting my other self. Half is gone, the other remains solitary. How would it be possible to articulate personal intimacy more powerfully? Walpole identifies with his friend, and in doing so, he recalls what Montaigne calls perfect friendship. The perfect friendship I'm talking about, each gives himself so entirely to his friend that he has nothing to share with another. So it's a kind of classic model of friendship in the 18th century, and Horace, at least in this one instant, felt that he was abiding by it. An entirely different Horace emerges in his letters to women, whether to the Duchess of Grafton, later the Countess of Upper Ossory, Madame du Deffand, his friend from French society, or Anne Damer, his second cousin, his friends, Agnes and Mary Berry, most especially Mary, his intimate friend and literary executor. These letters speak worlds about the friendship between men and women in the 18th century, and I think they've often been misread, too. In one of the earliest letters to the Countess, who was at this point the Duchess of Grafton, Walpole offers a kind of easy flattery that he employs when dealing with the opposite sex. The Duchess of Grafton was the Honorable Anne Liddell. She was the daughter of Henry Liddell, first Baron Ravensworth, and Anne Delmay. She married Augustus Fitzroy, the third Duke of Grafton, and in 1769 she married John Fitzpatrick, the second Earl of Upper Ossory. So she, in the course of Walpole's writing to her, she goes from being the Duchess to the Countess. She was quite notorious, too, in the 18th century, but we won't go into the full details of her life, but Horace's attachment to her was sincere, and she was one of his dearest friends. Here is a charming letter he writes to her, one of the first, and he has to report the beauties of the Queen. In this case, it's Queen Charlotte, the wife of the newly crowned George III, in about 1760. Is she right? Yeah, he's writing this in 1760 to the Duchess. To begin then, madam, she, the Queen, is of the best proportioned height in the world. Her person is so exactly formed that it would please, though motionless, and yet she has an air of as much dignity as is compatible with the most amiable softness. Her eyes have more fire, her teeth are whiter, her hair better disposed, her neck. Oh, Lord bless me, I forgot. It was the Queen I was to describe. She is nothing of all this. She is unlike the description I have been giving, as every woman in the world is but one. The Queen is very tall, plump, and handsome, and has a fine color, will have a fine color and a little mouth. But she is very young, and these charms are to come. In the meantime, His Majesty, who is all goodness, is perfectly happy without them. Walpole's flattery to the Duchess and his studied stammering and hesitation all make this a charming letter to consider, his earliest letter to her. All of Walpole's techniques of irony and indirection are here given special significance. He seems intent on flattering his interlocutor. The letter becomes a display of double entendre that bodes well for all the letters that follow, and it is. The Walpole editors say that this is one of the most entertaining correspondences, and it truly is. All the letters to her. We don't have many of hers. Well, he didn't seem to have saved hers, but she obviously saved all his. He also asked people to save letters, and he also asked them to send them back letters so he could publish them. What is interesting about this flattery is Walpole's ability to make a joke of the Queen without abusing her, and to celebrate the Duchess without writing mere flattery. This is a tone that emerges in these letters alone. Here the renowned wit subjects his talents to a lady's approval, stammering and hesitating as he does. Walpole uses the letter form as a type of flattery. Surely the Duchess of Grafton can only have been charmed. This is the kind of letter writing where Horace does seem most engaging. This is the first letter he writes to the Duchess. The last letter he writes to the Countess of Upper Ossory in 1797 strikes a completely different tone. This is the year of his death, and he says, "My dear madam, you distress me infinitely by showing my idle notes, which I cannot conceive can amuse anybody. My old-fashioned breeding impels me every now and then to reply to the letters you honor me with writing, but in truth very unwillingly, for I seldom can have anything particular to say. I scarce go out of my own house, and then only to 2 or 3 very private places where I see nobody that really knows anything, and what I learn comes from newspapers that collect intelligence from coffee houses, consequently, what I neither believe nor report. At home I see only a few charitable elders, except about 80 nephews and nieces of various ages, who are each brought to me about once a year to stare at me as the Methuselah of the family, and they can only speak of their own contemporaries, which interests me no more than if they talked of their dolls or balls, or bats or balls. Must not the result of this, madam, make me a very entertaining correspondence? Pray send no more such laurels, which I desire no more than their leaves, when decked with scrap of tinsel and stuck on 12th cakes that lie on the shop boards of pastry cooks at Christmas. I should be quite content with a sprig of rosemary thrown after me when the parson of the parish commits my dust to dust. Till then, pray, madam, accept the resignation of your ancient servant, O." And he signs this, the last few letters of his life, he signs O for Orford, because he became the Lord of Orford when his nephew died. His father was created Lord Orford when he was defeated in the House of Commons and moved into the House of Lords. His lordship was the Lord of Orford. Then his eldest son was second Lord, and that Lord died, and his son, and Horace was the next in line. So he became, and he was very proud of this title, obviously by signing the letter with the O of Orford instead of the HW that he often uses. The distress expressed here is genuine. The cry of protest is sincere. He writes a letter that commemorates their long correspondence in terms that she can recognize, and he stops short of demanding that she destroy his letters. Instead, we have this bittersweet communication that brings the correspondence to a close in an elegant and appropriate manner. O for Orford offers his resignation as her interlocutor, and he asks her to throw a sprig of rosemary rather than the laurels she has bedecked him with. He gives an account of his final years that is moving, and he explains coherently why his letters have ceased to be amusing. This is Walpole at his most naked and exposed, and it is touching that he ends his correspondence with a society friend by pleading with her to understand the distress of his situation. He does so in such a way, of course, that she can do nothing but add it to the collection that has come before. Horace emerges as a complex and engaging individual in the letters I have quoted this evening, ranging further in the 48 volumes of the Yale correspondence. We find that this impression is only complicated and intensified. If I have decided to use the letters as the basis of my life of Horace, that is in part because he lived nowhere else so intimately, so ecstatically. I think we find in the letters the true Horace, even when posturing or pouting, when calling in favors or handing out treats. Whether laughing or crying, Horace Walpole becomes most himself when he is writing these letters. And that is the Horace Walpole that I am hoping to celebrate. Thanks. I would be happy to entertain any questions. We have some time, so yes. I think you have to wait for a microphone so that Well, it has to be recorded. I think they're recording everything.
I'm wondering how all these male friends addressed each other. Was it always Mr. This and Mr. That to their faces, or did they sometimes use first names?
They used first names when they were talking to each other, but when they wrote about each other, they always used last names. Last names, because we occasionally in the letters of school friends, Eton College friends like Thomas Gray, those letters are in first names. And in his letters to his cousin Henry Seymour Conway, it's always Horry and Henry. Horry and Harry. So they use first names. But whenever it was about someone who was in the world, they would use Mr. So-and-so. Or Sir. Often it's aristocrats, there's Sir so-and-so. Yes?
So, George, can you tell us more about how you got interested in Horace Walpole?
I'd be happy to. So, I read The Castle of Otranto in an 18th century novel class in 1968 at Holy Cross College in Worcester. And it was a little Gothic unit we were doing. And I found the novel just engaging beyond. It's a short novel. It's not very complicated, but it was fascinating. And when I got to graduate school and wrote a dissertation on Gothic fiction, Horace was the first person I wrote about. And I've written several books, as Nicole listed at the beginning. Horace is in each of them, except maybe women novelists. But he's in every other book. I've always come back to him. And I came back to Farmington with the project of writing a book about the letters, which I did, and I'm happy with that. And I think it brought out some of the things I was talking about today. But I just feel there's not a good biography. There's the Ketton Cremer. There's a terrible biography by Timothy Mole. So I think Horace deserves better. But still, I can't get away from the letters, so it's going to be some kind of biography through the letters. But thanks for asking that. Yes?
So you mentioned that when he's writing to women, he expresses a lot of flattery, and I would say that that's especially true in his correspondence with Mary Berry later in his life. Mary Berry claims that Horace Walpole at some point offered to make her a countess so that she would be provided with a jointure and the title, and there's some debate over whether or not that actually happened or if it was done in jest. I was wondering your thoughts on whether he ever seriously considered marrying his friend.
Well, so that's the $64,000 question. Did he mean it when he said he wanted to marry her? I think he so cared for her, and she was so kind to him in those later years that he did seriously consider it. I don't think it ever came close to happening for various reasons, but I think he loved her that much. Also, I had a section of this about the letters to her, but it was long, and I just took it out because it seemed to make the talk too long. But his letters to her are more petulant than his letters to anyone else. She's always upset that she isn't there when she's supposed to be there, and always wondering when she's coming back, and why has she left him for 2 days without telling him, and things like that. And those don't make pretty letters. So I'm not sure what to say about what kind of possessiveness he felt over her. Like he wanted somehow to own her, and that's the negative side of that. But I do think he cared for her very, very much. Earlier in his life, he was busy making marriage plans for other people that would give them titles and so on. So it's not unlikely that he thought this would be something he'd bestow on her. Perhaps didn't think of bestowing his person on her as well, but we don't know. But I think that's a great question. Sure.
Thanks, George. That was terrific. Could you take us back to the slide of Horace in the library for a sec?
Yeah, I think.
There we go. Do you have any information about the spaniel under the chair?
So he always had dogs. He had very famous dogs. The most famous dog, of course, is Tory. That he took on the Grand Tour, and Tory was the one that was eaten by a wolf as they're crossing the Alps. and he has a great lament for. This particular dog, I'm not sure.
Well, I actually just wanted to hear the animal stories in the letters.
That was the story you wanted. But he did always have dogs, and he often talks about in his letters there are news about the dogs for other people who have dogs. There are some of these pictures that don't have the dog. At least I've seen a couple. And this is cut from a much larger where you can see that these windows are Gothic windows as well. Yeah, but Torrey was the most famous of his dog, but he had several. Joe. Sorry, Nicole, you'll be next.
Thanks for this, George. It's so wonderful to see this work coming together with such rich associations throughout your previous publications. You laid the table of these many friendships, and one couldn't list them all in such a long and complicated life. But I was particularly wondering about Kitty Clive in the association of female friendship. Not so much the correspondent, but the domestic neighbor.
Yeah.
Strawberry
Little
property.
Strawberry. Yeah. Well, so Kitty Clive was an actor, a rather famous actress in the 18th century, and then she retired to a house that Horace provided on the grounds of Strawberry Hill, Little Strawberry it's called. Is it around still? I don't think so. I'm not sure. Anyway, and she was part of his circle, and he was very attached to her. I can't say too much more than that about why she was there, but if he didn't rank his friends according to how much what position they had in public life. He really responded to people on personal terms, and he liked her, and he sponsored her and was kind to her, and I think we don't need to know much more than that. I don't know, maybe Carolyn, do you know anything more about Kitty Clive? But she's certainly an important figure in his life. And Diana Beauclerk also, a similar kind of protection, care, encouraging as an artist. There's the wonderful Diana Beauclerk cabinet that is in the library, and when you open it up, they're all the illustrations for The Mysterious Mother. I hope that will be on display when we have the Mysterious Mother Symposium in the spring. But looking at you, I suppose there should be a larger story about Walpole and the theater. And there isn't there are not lots of great accounts of 18th century stage events or theatrical events or opera, just a few. But he was interested, but more he read about them. He didn't go to too many. Yeah.
I'll just say we actually had this week a fellow at the Walpole Library who's working specifically on the domestic theatricals done at Strawberry Hill. And that's Judith, right over there.
Do you want to say something?
Hello. I don't have a huge amount to say about Kitty Clive, but I have been working for a month on Walpole's interest in the theatre, and he used theatre metaphors all the time in his writings and his letters. He used the theatre as a way of satirising politics. His wonderful satire, The Dear Witches, about the way the patriots had become kind of monstrous. He had a collection of, 62 volumes of playtext? 62 volumes. Each volume contains about 5 playtexts. And I discovered yesterday that one of them is very heavily marked up, and I think it might have been marked up by today I was finding this out, it might have been marked up by Anne Damer. He went to private theatricals all the time. He printed plays by Elizabeth Craven and other of his aristocratic friends who put on plays. So he's absolutely steeped in the theatre world. He had very strong opinions about theatre. He had the famous thing about life as a tragedy to those who feel and a comedy to those who think. But then he wrote a series of letters on his thoughts about comedy and tragedy. So it wasn't just a bon mot. He actually really seriously thought about tragedy. The Castle of Otranto is kind of written in 5 acts, like a play. So I think the theatre is absolutely, it's one of his many, many lives. It's not in any way the dominant one, or it can't replace all the many lives that you have very skillfully laid out for us.
No, but
I
think you're right.
I think it's a thread that really runs through a lot of what he does.
Absolutely. And The Mysterious Mother wouldn't have been possible if he hadn't been steeped in theater, because The Mysterious Mother is one of the great tragedies of the 18th century, I think. And I think it looks back to Jacobean tragedy especially, but he would have to know a lot to be able to write that play. Yeah. Nicole.
Well, my original question was, I know, I can't break the rules of all people. So one of Lewis's points, of course, in doing the Yale edition was to get both sides of the correspondence, so you wouldn't be just hearing one side of the phone conversation, the metaphor that Lewis used. And of course, there is so much correspondence, and in many cases, both sides, but not always. Is there a particular correspondence that you wish we had the other side of? That you'd love to know what the other side was?
You know, a couple of things I wish. I wish that Horace and John Shute weren't together so much, because then they might have written more letters to each other, right? I also wish that his letter to his cousin, that there are hundreds of those letters. We have all of Henry Seymour's letters, because Horace kept them, but we have very few of Horace's letters. And I think all of those close personal friends, when there's a side missing, I'd like to have both sides of those. But I think we should be grateful for how many we do have, like the letters back and forth to Man, and it shows you what a friendship could be. It's about politics, but it's about everything else, about family, about health, about personal experiences, about friendships, and those are wonderful to see both sides. And it's wonderful to have them printed together like that in the Walpole edition. Doing the biography, the digital, the letters in just the last decade have become digital, so you can also search by year, and of course writing a biography, it helps to see things by year, and it really changes the way you read them when you see them in sequence. Yes? Somebody will get there with a...
We'll get there.
Was The Mysterious Mother ever produced on stage?
No, it was produced, it was just performed privately, and...
How did the audience react?
Well, it depends who you're asking. When Frances Burney attended a reading, she decided that Horace Walpole was the most detestable man she ever heard of, and she had nothing to do with him after that. Other people loved it. Man loved it. Friends and intimates said it was great. People really celebrated it. Horace wanted it. There's a controversy about whether he ever really wanted it to publish. I think he wanted to produce it. I think he wanted it on the stage, but that never happened. I don't think. In my recollection, it didn't happen.
Not in his lifetime, but there was a 1812 production
1812, yeah.
David Warhol.
Thank you. I knew it was sometime, but not him. And he, the first thing Mann said back when he read it, he said, "That's a marvelous tragedy for the closet." So he didn't want it to get out at all.
But the library has a lot of handwritten copies of them.
It was circulated. I think it got around. No. It was no question that people read it. People devoured it, and it was Walpole's play, and everyone wanted to read it. But it's too bad there wasn't a theatrical producer among the crowd that could just put it on.
Hi, back here. Sorry. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about Walpole the collector, and whether his strategy was sort of informed by, amateur or professional sort of ideas of the time, or whether he sort of reveled in the idea that his was sort of singular, and that he and his choice friends, including Shute, had sort of...
Well, that's a great question. I think he did not see himself as singular as a collector. He just thought of himself as the best collector and the most informed collector, and he and his friends were the best judges of what was collectible or not collectible. And other people thought that. One person who thought that was Beckford, who was desperate to get inside at Strawberry Hill, and he wasn't admitted. I don't know if Horace was sick or what, or just didn't want to see Beckford, so he was sent away, and he was furious, and he was always trying to get at Strawberry Hill. And he tried, when Horace died, he tried to go and get in and get some of the materials. No. But when finally the last Lord Waldegrave died or when they decided to sell the collection in 1840, Beckford was still alive. And Beckford was a competing Gothic novelist and younger and notorious in his lifetime. He sent buyers, and he told them exactly, these letters are wonderful, Stephen Clark has written about this, telling them exactly what they were to get out of the collection. Don't go away, I don't care what it costs, but get this piece and get that piece. And so he finally got what he wanted out of Horace Walpole's collection, but had to wait a long time. But otherwise, I think his father, as I said briefly, his family had been collectors. His father amassed an incredible collection of artwork at Houghton, one of the great estates in North Norfolk. And even today, if you go to Houghton, it has great artwork in it, one of the most distinguished. So I think it came to him through his genes, as he knew that he could collect. He knew that there were things to... He writes a letter, I didn't quote in this talk, but he goes to Herculaneum when it's just open to tourists. And he's so appalled that it's so disorganized and people are just grabbing things and there's not a system and there's not... and he seems to understand how things should proceed from a collector's point of view. So that's a... Yeah, sure. That's...
Hi. I just wanted to say, as a librarian and as a great fan of the Walpole Library, I was reading an article by Rob Hume in 18th Century Life this year, and he has it was an article about what constitutes evidence, and he said that he thought it was such a shame that more people don't use evidence that's available to them, and he called out specifically the 80 volumes of the Walpole correspondence that are available.
They're only 48. They're only 48, but that's a tall order. They're fat volumes.
I mean, they're fat volumes, yeah.
Yeah.
That are available for free on the, and that are digitized. And he said especially the last 4 volumes, which are, an incredible index. 4 volumes of dense index, and I thought that was just really a nice thing. And
yes, and that index. Really, before the days of computers, that index is astonishing index of 18th century life and culture. That they put it together just, at the library in Farmington is amazing. I know this is just a footnote to collecting. I thought of it and then it went out of my head. But W.S. Lewis himself was a collector, and quite a collector. And he was the person who just knew that he wanted to collect but didn't know what. And then he was one time in a bookshop or in London, I think this is the story, and found a packet of letters and looked at them, and they were Horace Walpole letters, and he thought, oh, I'll collect Horace Walpole. And that then became his life's work. And I think he learned collecting as he went along and became if you ever visit Farmington, the number of materials from Strawberry Hill and the artifacts, as well as all the letters that he, traipsed around England trying to pin down people and get them out of people's chests and under beds and things. He just got those letters. It's an amazing story.
Okay, I think maybe it's time to go upstairs.
Yes, well, thank you all for coming. I enjoyed this.